Here on the Flow News 24 desk, it's good to welcome the opposition leader in Victoria, Matthew Guy. Hi Matthew, how are you?
Terrific, thanks.
Great to recently see you out on the walks supporting the Ukrainian people. You obviously have a soft spot there and a heritage from that part of the world.
I do. My mother's family's from Ukraine. They pretty much all still live there. They're in the east of the country, so it's quite raw, the whole issue for myself and the family, because my mum obviously speaks to her cousins fairly frequently, and all of them are still over there, and, they're living through a war zone, so it does become quite real.
It's a very real response when you see somebody in public life here in Australia who is visibly watching on to something that is happening there, and our thoughts and prayers are always with people who are in conflict situations. I want to get to politics now with you, Matthew, and the key questions for people in the northwest of Victoria is this Murray Basin Rail project. Now, the background of this is the federal coalition with the federal member Anne Webster had promised the additional $200 million to finish the project, that the Victorian government was the shortfall on it. But now that federal Labor have come to power, it's my understanding that Anthony Albanese is yet to commit to the $200 million federally for that project.
Well, it's got to be finished, and we've got to get on with it. It can't just keep going stop, start, maybe done, maybe not. This is a very, very important piece of rail infrastructure upgrade for the northwest. And improving rail and rail services to the northwest is so important, particularly around freight and getting those goods to markets quicker. I would only encourage the federal government as much as they can to the new federal government to come to the party where the Liberal and National parties had both done, which is to provide any monies to get the project done. On top of that, the state government, though, they're spending around $170 billion worth of projects in Melbourne. For just $200 million, they could make a contribution and get this project done. So it beats me when they blow out projects by $28 billion. They blow them out in Melbourne by that amount, and yet they can't come to the party to fix what is one of the most important projects outside of Melbourne.
It is an important project for our GDP in Victoria, but I want to also put the question to you. If you're elected in November, will you come up with a $200 million shortfall?
If the feds don't come up with it, then we'll certainly have a look at doing that, because we need to finish the project. Peter Walsh has said on a number of occasions, that this project is so vital for the northwest. We can't keep stalling on it. But I don't want to give the federal government an out by saying, "Oh well, if you don't, I will," because it's their responsibility now to do that too. And there's been a lot of commitments made about providing extra money to Victoria. Well, okay, here's a project and where you can start it. So I hope they get on and do it.
Now, looking at the line to Mildura, it obviously has already been upgraded and it could take passenger rail. Is there any commitment from a elected coalition government in Victoria to returning passenger rail to Mildura?
I made this commitment at the 2018 election. It was more difficult because you've got a break of gauge, which would probably be around Ballarat. So you'd have to provide funding to get the standard gauge into Ballarat station, and then passengers to Melbourne would have to get out conceivably at Ballarat and then change into a broad gauge train to take you down to Melbourne. Look, I'm willing to look at it. I'm a big fan of passenger rail. I've taken it in every line across the state, multiple times actually, and so I'm certainly happy to look at it as it have to be a two-train process with the two gauges, but I am more than happy to look at it because I think the reintroduction of rail is very important.
Having a look at the engine room of agriculture for the economy again, and the fact that in the northwest, while we've got a sparse population, we do have an enormous amount of productivity in the horticulture and wines and or your stone fruits and almonds, and then the grain crops too, of course, that we've been talking about. But the economy does rely on water, particularly the irrigated crops, and with the Murray-Darling Basin plan coming to an end in this next term for the federal government, at a state level, do you as a Victorian elected government, would you support further buybacks in the plan in order to reach the 450 gigalitres needed for the environment?
Look, that's pretty complex. I haven't spoken to Peter Walsh around that, or Steph Ryan, that's the Shadow Agriculture and Shadow Water Minister, but we're obviously fairly concerned, or fairly keen, I should say, to make sure that the Northwest has got what it needs in terms of its agricultural production and its ability to keep going economically. So I'm more than happy to take advice again from locals, or indeed from the Shadow Water Minister, as to what the best way forward would be, because we can't have water shortfalls in an area which is so dependent on it. And from my point of view, the Sunraysia is, as you say, it may be the largest in population, although Mildura at 50,000 is quite large, and the economy is dependent on constant water to be able to irrigate those horticultural blocks. So I'm more than happy to do that.
Would you support funding by the Victorian government, even in conjunction with, say, a federal government on building or raising the height of existing dams in Victoria?
That's pretty complex. I'm not sure the answer to that, but if that's what needs to be done, I'm happy to look at it as well. I mean, it is obviously of keen interest to the Northwest, and if that's what's on the table, I'm happy to consider it.
Something that was on the table in New South Wales, raising the height there, and under a coalition-elected state government there, they were having an opposed view to the federal government of a coalition brand at the same time. So it is an important question, I think, that people are asking in regional areas: why don't we build more dams in the Great Divide or raise the height of existing ones?
Well, this is an issue, particularly in the south of the Divide, where we've got water insecurity, and that's going to be one of the greatest challenges of our times. So, particularly in places like the Thomson. But of course, that then has environmental flow impacts. So we do need to look at both ends of the scale, and if that means we do a feasibility study into it, then we do it.
Looking at the hospital situation for Mildura, you've already been on the record as committing $750 million. The local independent member there, Ali Kappa, had put up for the Andrews government and had asked them for $500 million. Is the commitment for the $750 million, if elected, would you begin building that hospital within the 4-year term of a coalition-elected government?
Yes, we would. And it's not just a hospital, it's also a teaching facility there as well. So it needs to be a new site, a teaching facility and a hospital. The importance of that is because getting more nurses and physicians into the system is important where they train. If kids coming through university, for instance, or indeed coming through school wanted to become into the health system, then where they train is most likely where they stay. So if we can train them in Mildura, then we're most likely to retain them in Mildura. And that's why having a teaching facility with the hospital is so important. And that's what we've committed to do. Find a new site, have a brand new hospital and a brand new teaching facility. And most importantly, that means then kids who are doing studies in health, a whole range of health areas, can then stay in Mildura. And that's the biggest issue to me, is retaining those country health professionals. So they're born and bred in Mildura in the Sunraysia, they're trained in the Sunraysia, and then their career is in the Sunraysia. And that to me is so important.
There's a view amongst the people of the Mallee, or outback Victoria as some are wanting to call it these days, that the road system is been neglected under the Andrews Labor government. Yet the Sunraysia Highway was looked at for federal funding the last election, and Webster had made that announcement. The likelihood, though, of that occurring now that federal Labor are in power and those funds coming through to a Sunraysia Highway upgrade would mean that the elected Victorian coalition government might become responsible for that. Would you look to upgrade the Sunraysia Highway with those passing lanes and with those shoulder extensions that are needed, and likewise other infrastructure of highways in the northwest of Victoria if elected?
Yes, we have said that we're going to bring down a country and regional roads package, which will try and pick up some of that backlog that has occurred over 8 years of Labor government. They have withdrawn funds out of country Victoria and put a lot into Metro Melbourne. The Country Roads and Bridges Fund, for instance, was funding a bridge upgrade in Mulgrave from the Premier's electorate, which is really silly. It's there for country roads and bridges. And we know there's a huge problem with the quality of our country roads and highways, particularly in the southwest, but also in the northwest. And so there's a huge amount of work to do, which we've committed to getting on with if we get elected.
Okay, and your candidate is Paul Matheson. Now, you're going up here against, in this particular election, the Nationals. Their candidate is Jade Benham. Do you have a preference of those two, if either of those two were to be elected and beat the current incumbent, Ali Cupper, the Independent?
Well, I'm the leader of the Liberal Party, so obviously I prefer a Liberal candidate everywhere, but in a three-quarter contest we have the benefit of a Liberal or National candidate. At the end of the day, my target is to represent the Liberal Party, but also to defeat the Labor government. We're in partnership in a coalition with the National Party. We work exceptionally well with the National Party. Peter Walsh and I have a great relationship and talk very, very frequently. So we're confident running a government together will be quite a powerful thing for all of Victoria, wherever our members get elected.
And a question that regional people have had over the health crisis, the pandemic of COVID-19. They've been, in many cases, the restrictions that have been brought to bear across regional Victoria have been restrictions that have been, in many cases, people have said they were unwarranted and over the top. They were excessive compared to what may have been needed. The Andrews government's handling with the ring of steel, if you like, around the metro part of the state. Do you have a view on the handling of the pandemic by the Andrews government?
Well, the government has still not released the full health advice to many of these decisions. So when the ring of steel or playgrounds were shut or Mildura was locked down when the closest COVID case was in Airport West in the suburbs of Melbourne. When these decisions were made, the government said, the Premier said, that was all based on health advice. Now, we've seen health orders, which is the mechanism to implement the health advice, but we haven't actually ever seen the advice. And I question whether or not the advice ever recommended that these kind of heavy-handed measures were ever the best way to go. Why did it make sense to the government to lock down places like Walpia or Murrayville when the closest case of COVID was in Airport West in Melbourne? That didn't make any sense. And if they were going to do that, they owed the decency to every Victorian to be transparent and show us that health advice. But see, the whole way through COVID, this government has never, ever done that. And therein leads a crisis of integrity in this state at the moment. When the Corruption Commission has its funding cut, and the Ombudsman has its funding cut, when health advice isn't released, you start to ask, well, why would the Premier behave like that unless he had something to hide?
So if elected, would you have a Royal Commission into the handling of COVID-19 in Victoria?
Yes, we've committed to do that. I think that's the right thing to do. More people died in Victoria during COVID than sadly during our Vietnam War commitment. And of course, we know that's one of the saddest periods in our nation's history. So therefore, we want to make sure that it's properly investigated. I think it's the right thing to do. I mean, every Victorian who's lost a family member or known a friend who's passed away or who just lived through some of the world's longest lockdowns, particularly the world's longest lockdowns here in Melbourne. We're entitled to know what happened, why it happened, and if it comes around again, that those kind of decisions are made properly and transparently. And that's what a Royal Commission will do.
So in November, when the state election happens, what does Matthew Guy offer the people of regional Victoria if you were to be elected?
Confidence, getting our economy back on its feet, making sure our kids are kept at school, and rebuilding our health system. So important to get our state going again. And the way to get our state going again, as I said, is confidence. Get confidence back in Victoria. But you won't get confidence back in our state if we're constantly talking about pandemic laws, possible lockdowns, state of emergency, state of disaster. We've got to move on from all of that. The best way to do that is to manage COVID issues sensibly and then have a state government that encourages growth. That's what we're trying to do.
Excellent. My guest this morning is Matthew Guy here on the Flow News 24 desk. We thank you for your time.
Thanks very much.